What happens when a CEO orders a meal at his restaurant and discovers the truth hidden behind tired smiles? Ethan Brooks had built Family Grill from nothing. 13 locations across Riverdale. 10 years of sacrifice. Late nights, missed family dinners, endless paperwork. But lately, something felt wrong. Complaints had been piling up. Customers whispering about slow service, cold food, and rude staff. Employee turnover is higher than ever. Yet every report from his regional managers told the same story. Everything's fine, just a rough patch. Nothing unusual. But Ethan wasn't the kind of leader to trust numbers over people. So he made a decision, one that would change everything. He drove 2 hours away from his glass office tower, back to the very heart of where it all began, Family Grill, Brookville location, a place he hadn't stepped foot in for years. No expensive suits today, no polished shoes or corporate mask, just a worn-out hoodie, a scruffy beard grown in over weeks, and glasses thick enough to make him disappear in plain sight. He didn't want to be the boss today. He wanted to be invisible, because sometimes the only way to see the truth, it is to sit quietly in the corner and listen. And so, Ethan Brooks walked through Family Grill, Brookville, ordered a meal like any ordinary customer, unaware of what he was about to witness, would not only break his heart, but forever change the future of his company. The first thing that struck Ethan Brooks as he settled into a corner booth at Family Grill was how different the place's energy felt from the vision he'd built years ago. It wasn't the decor that was still humble, familiar, even comforting with its worn wooden tables and checkered napkins. It wasn't the customers either. Families chatting over late breakfast, elderly couples sharing coffee refills, or kids dangling their legs off the vinyl seats. No, what caught Ethan's attention wasn't what people were doing. It was what people weren't doing. No laughter, no easy conversation between staff, no lighthearted jokes across the kitchen pass like they used when Family Grill first opened its doors. Instead, there was tension, tight, stretched in like a rubber band about to snap. And moving right through the heart of that tension was her, Emily Parker. He noticed her the moment she approached his table, not because she stood out with anything flashy. Quite the opposite. She was young, maybe 25, slender, pale from long shifts under artificial lights. Her uniform was crisp, but you could tell it had been washed one too many times. Her sneakers, they weren't the cheap standard issue some restaurants handed out. They were old, but clean, carefully maintained like someone who couldn't afford a new pair, but refused to let them fall apart either. "Hi there," she greeted me with a soft voice that carried both fatigue and kindness in equal measure. "Welcome to Family Grill. What can I get started for you?" Her smile, it wasn't forced. It wasn't the tired, robotic customer service grin he'd seen in countless places. This was different. It was warm but fragile. The kind of smile built less from company policy and more from the simple human belief that every person deserved kindness. Ethan ordered a black coffee. As Emily turned away to fetch it, he watched her closely. The way her eyes flicked from table to table, scanning without being obvious, spotting an elderly man struggling with his coat. She was there in seconds, helping him with gentle respect. A young mother trying to cut pancakes while wrangling a toddler. Emily dropped off extra napkins and offered crayons without being asked. Little things. Things that wouldn't show up on any performance report. But these things told Ethan far more about her character than any employee file could. She returned with his coffee, placing it down carefully, and just as quickly disappeared into the whirlwind of a lunchtime rush. That's when he saw him. Scott Turner, the shift manager. 45 years old, broad-shouldered with a permanent scowl, a man who had long since traded leadership for control. Ethan watched as Scott barked orders from the kitchen window, not with urgency, but with contempt. "Emily, you're falling behind again. Table 7's been waiting forever. Move faster, or you'll be clearing tables the rest of your shift." The words hit harder than they should have. Not because of what was said, but how. Sharp, public, designed not to correct, but to humiliate. Ethan clenched his jaw. This wasn't the culture he had built, not even close. But what struck him even deeper was Emily's response. No argument, no eye roll, just a quick nod, shoulders tightening for just a second before relaxing again as she hurried off to fix the mistake that wasn't even hers. And yet, seconds later, she was back at another table, kneeling beside an elderly woman with hearing aids, speaking slowly and clearly with that same unshaken gentleness. "Take your time, Ms. Harlow. I'll put your order in just how you like it." As Ethan sat in silence, observing the patterns of this place, he realized something else. Emily wasn't just doing her job. She was holding this place together. She was a reason this diner still felt, barely, like Family Grill. Not Scott, not the systems. Her. The next hour unfolded like a quiet storm, Scott growing more irritable as orders piled up. Emily absorbed blow after blow, without a single harsh word in return. But Ethan saw the cracks. The subtle way she rubbed her temples when no one was looking. The careful stretch of her back when she thought she was hidden behind the drink station. The soft sigh, not of frustration, but exhaustion. This wasn't sustainable. And yet, she stayed kind. She stayed patient. And when a teenage boy at table 9 nervously confessed he was $3 short on his bill, Emily didn't hesitate. "Don't worry about it," she whispered with a conspiratorial smile. "It happens. Just pay it forward next time." From his booth in the corner, Ethan watched this invisible act of grace and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just a staffing issue. This wasn't just bad management. This was a failure of leadership. His leadership. And as he watched Emily disappear into the kitchen again, preparing to take another wave of disrespect from Scott Turner, Ethan Brooks knew one thing for sure. Tomorrow, everything was going to change. Ethan Brooks sat in his car long after the last customer had left Family Grill that night. The neon sign of the restaurant still hummed faintly behind him, casting long shadows on the empty parking lot. But his eyes weren't on the building anymore. They were quietly following Emily Parker. She moved across the lot alone, her slender frame slightly hunched, the weight of exhaustion pulling at her steps. The brightness she showed to customers had long faded from her face, replaced now by quiet resilience. Ethan didn't know exactly why, but something in his heart told him to follow, not out of suspicion, but out of respect, out of the kind of concern that rises only when you witness silent goodness. Emily climbed onto an old bicycle, its paint chipped, the front basket loosely tied with worn rope. No car, no warm jacket for the cold night, no friend walking beside her. Only quiet, only solitude. Ethan followed at a respectful distance in the sedan, the hum of his engine blending with the distant sound of Riverdale's quiet working-class streets. She pedaled slowly through dimly lit neighborhoods, past aging apartment buildings, past corner stores already closed for night, until finally, she turned onto a narrow alley behind a cluster of old rental units. It was the poorest part of town. Laundry lines stretched between windows. Children's toys lay scattered near steps that looked ready to give way. And there, beneath a flickering street lamp, she stopped. She locked her bicycle beside a rusting metal staircase and climbed quietly to the second floor. Her home, if you could call it that. Ethan's heart tightened as he saw the modest door, its peeling paint, its number barely clinging to the surface. But what struck him the most was what happened next. The door opened before Emily could even knock. An elderly woman, frail, hunched with age, stood there, oxygen tubing looped beneath her nose. Her face lit up the moment she saw Emily. "You're home, honey," the woman whispered weakly. Emily smiled, a real, tired but genuine smile, and stepped forward immediately, catching her mother in a gentle embrace. "I'm home, Mom." The words were so soft, yet they felt heavier than anything Ethan had heard all day inside the dim apartment. Ethan could see how sparse everything was. A small table, 2 chairs, Old medical equipment is tucked in the corner. No TV, no luxury, not even curtains on the window, only a thin, fading cloth to block the chill. And yet, there was warmth. There was love. Emily guided her mother back inside, helped her sit down, and without even removing her apron, she knelt to adjust the worn slippers on her mother's frail feet. Every motion spoke of patience, of care, of duty not forced but chosen. Ethan sat there for a long moment, unmoving. This wasn't just an overworked waitress. This was a daughter holding up her entire world, quietly, invisibly, while carrying the crushing weight of survival. He watched as she went about her routine, heating a small pot of soup, pouring a glass of water, sitting across from her mother, asking softly about her day, listening carefully to every word, even though she looked like she could barely keep her eyes open. Later, when the lights inside dimmed, Ethan slowly drove away. But something had changed inside him. This was what being a leader was supposed to be about. Not spreadsheets, not bottom lines, but people like Emily, people the world often overlooked, people who chose kindness when no one was watching, people who, despite being treated poorly, still turned around and gave the best of themselves to others. As he drove through the quiet streets of Riverdale back to his hotel, Ethan's mind raced. He thought of her strange smile at work, of the way Scott Turner barked orders without ever seeing the woman behind the apron, of the cruel system that rewarded loudness over heart. And he knew tomorrow things would change. Tomorrow, he wouldn't just be watching. Tomorrow, he would start taking back his company, not just for himself, but for people like Emily Parker, the forgotten heart of Family Grill. That night, after everything Ethan had seen, sleep didn't come easily. He lay awake in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling, his mind playing back every small detail. The tired look in Emily's eyes, the way she forced a gentle smile for customers even when her body was exhausted, the moment she handed over her last few dollars to cover a struggling mother's meal. But what gnawed at him the most was Scott Turner. Ethan had built Family Grill with a dream that no employee would ever feel small in his company, no voice would go unheard, and no kindness would go unrewarded. Yet here he was, watching one of his longest-running locations slowly turn into everything he despised about the restaurant industry. Scott Turner, 45 years old, a man who should have been a mentor, a guide for the younger staff, was instead the very worst kind of leader, arrogant, manipulative, and willing to crush anyone beneath him if it meant saving face or money. And tonight, Ethan was going to learn just how deep Scott's cruelty ran. The next day, Ethan arrived early at Family Grill again, dressed in the same worn-out jeans and hoodie. This time, he didn't sit in the main dining area. Instead, he chose a quiet corner near the back, within earshot of the staff-only corridor that led to the break room and kitchen. For hours, he sat there, silently nursing a cup of black coffee, simply observing. It didn't take long to confirm his suspicions. Scott Turner wasn't just a bad manager. He was a predator in a small pond, feeding off fear. Ethan listened as Scott berated a teenage busboy for missing a spot on a table, loud enough for customers to hear. You think anyone's going to tip you when you work like that? Do you even care about your job, or are you just here to breathe my air for free? The boy, no older than 17, kept his head down, muttering an apology that Scott didn't even acknowledge. Later, Ethan caught Scott cornering Adam Lewis, the 28-year-old chef who had offended Emily the night before, in the narrow kitchen hallway. "I saw you yesterday," Scott hissed, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. "You think standing up for that little waitress makes you some kind of hero? Let me remind you, you're replaceable. Everyone here is." Adam didn't flinch. "With all due respect, sir, if doing the right thing costs me this job, so be it." Scott sneered. "We'll see how long that attitude lasts when I start cutting your hours next week." Ethan's hands clenched beneath the table. The mask of an undercover customer was becoming harder to wear by the minute. But what truly shattered Ethan's calm facade was what Scott was planning for Emily. Later that afternoon, Scott retreated to a small office, leaving the door slightly ajar. Ethan took the risk, creeping closer just enough to overhear the conversation between Scott and another assistant manager. "You watch," Scott said with a cold chuckle. "Emily's next. She's too soft. Customers like her, sure. But that won't matter when I start docking her shifts, cutting her hours. She'll quit on her own. They always do." "But what if she doesn't?" the assistant asked hesitantly. Scott snorted. "Then I'll find something in the register that doesn't add up. Accuse her of mishandling money. Once corporate hears about that, she's done. Clean exit. No questions." The assistant fell silent, too afraid to disagree. Ethan stood there, frozen, his stomach turned. This wasn't just bad management. This was calculated cruelty, abuse of power, a direct attack on one of the most compassionate human beings he had ever observed working in a restaurant. And worse, Scott had been getting away with it for years. That night, as the last customers left Family Grill and the staff began their closing routines, Ethan sat in his car just outside, watching, waiting. Emily stepped outside into the cool Riverdale evening, her figure small beneath the glow of the streetlights. She moved more slowly today. The burden of exhaustion was weighing on every step. Adam followed shortly after, catching up to her with a quiet, protective presence. They walked together down the sidewalk, heading toward the rough part of town Ethan had followed Emily to the night before. Ethan leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. His decision was made. Tomorrow, things would change. Tomorrow, Scott Turner would learn what real leadership looked like. And Emily Parker, she would finally know what it felt like to be protected, to be seen, to be honored for the quiet, powerful goodness that she carried, even when no one was watching. And Ethan Brooks, CEO of Family Grill, was ready to stand where he should have stood all along, right beside her. The sun was beginning to dip behind the rooftops of Riverdale when Ethan Brooks settled into his usual booth near the corner window at Family Grill. By now, he knew the rhythm of this place. The hurried footsteps, the forced smiles, the quiet exhaustion in the eyes of his workers. But tonight felt heavier. Ethan's gaze trailed Emily Parker, the 25-year-old waitress whose quiet strength had unexpectedly unsettled him. She moved like someone carrying far more than trays and menus. She carried the weight of survival, and yet her kindness never wavered. It was stitched into her every gesture, like a secret language for those who paid attention. But not everyone did. From the kitchen, the sharp, guttural bark of Scott Turner sliced through the hum of the diner. "Emily, for God's sake, how hard is it to get an order right?" The words weren't loud enough for customers to fully catch, but loud enough to wound. Emily froze mid-step, her knuckles whitening around a tray of drinks in her hands. Ethan felt a cold anger start to simmer in his chest. Scott's words weren't correction. They were humiliation. "Pick up the pacer clock out. We don't have time for sloppiness tonight." Scott spat, shoving a ticket onto the counter with enough force to knock over the salt shaker. Emily gave a tiny nod, the kind of motion that said, "I've been here before. I know the rules. Endure now, cry later." And she kept moving. But Ethan wasn't the only one watching. Near the kitchen line, Adam Lewis, the young chef, only 28, straightened up from his station, his jaw clenched tight, his dark eyes following Emily like a brother, watching a sister being bullied on the playground. "Enough, Scott," Adam said, his voice low but firm. Not loud, not reckless, but enough to challenge the toxicity spreading like grease in this place. Scott whipped his head around, sneering. "Excuse me, chef boy. Do you want to handle front too? Maybe clock her hours while you're at it?" Adam didn't back down. "She's doing her job. All of ours. And yours." The kitchen fell so still Ethan could almost hear Emily's shallow breathing from across the diner. Scott stormed toward Adam, puffing himself up like a man used to dominating a space through intimidation alone. "Watch your mouth. Kid, you've been here, what, 6 months? You think that gives you the right to tell me how to run my shift? Keep talking, and you'll be looking for another kitchen to work in. Adam stood his ground, not with bravado, but with something stronger. Quiet loyalty, quiet courage. I'd rather lose a job than lose respect, Adam replied. But I'll finish my shift. Emily deserves that. Ethan's heart tightened. This wasn't about food anymore. This was about dignity. He watched as Emily slipped into the back room for a moment, just behind the kitchen door. Alone, finally safe from customers' eyes. And that's when Ethan saw it. The fragile unraveling of a woman who had been too strong for too long. Her shoulders trembled. One hand covered her mouth to silence the sob that escaped. And still, she straightened up after a moment, wiped her face with trembling hand, and forced herself back through the door into the battlefield of customer service. Ethan gripped his coffee cup tightly. He had seen enough. This wasn't leadership. This wasn't our family grill. His family grill was supposed to be. As Emily walked past his table, her eyes downcast, Ethan said softly, just loud enough for her to hear, "Courage doesn't always look like fighting back. Sometimes it looks like showing up when the world dares you not to." Emily blinked, the barest flicker of surprise in her weary eyes, before she gave him a tiny, grateful nod and disappeared toward her tables. But Ethan wasn't done observing. He was done waiting. The next chapter of this night wouldn't be written in whispers or under his breath. Tomorrow, he would show Riverdale and this staff what leadership really looked like. And Scott Turner, his time of unchecked power was ending. Because Ethan Brooks, the real Ethan Brooks, wasn't just here for dinner anymore. He was here for justice. And justice was hungry. For a moment, Ethan Brooks sat in silence at the corner booth of Family Grill, the weight of what he had just witnessed pressing heavily on his chest. His knuckles tightened around the edge of the table. Emily Parker had quietly disappeared back to the dining room, her face pale, her eyes still glassy from holding back tears. Adam Lewis had returned to the kitchen, his jaw clenched in frustration, barely speaking a word as he prepped orders. And Scott Turner, the man who had poisoned his place with arrogance and cruelty, stood just a few feet away at the front counter, barking orders into the kitchen like nothing had happened. It was the last straw. Ethan rose slowly, smoothing the creases from his worn hoodie, the same hoodie that had allowed him to hide in plain sight for days. But not anymore. As he walked toward the center of the diner, the weight of every step felt deliberate, grounded not in anger alone, but in responsibility, in something deeper. He stopped right in front of the register, where Scott was flipping through receipts, still oblivious. "Scott Turner," Ethan said, his voice calm but unmistakably sharp. Scott barely looked up. "Yeah, what is it?" "You need some." But the moment his eyes met Ethan's, something shifted. That look, that quiet authority. It wasn't just another customer standing before him. Ethan reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Inside, gleaming like cold truth, was his company ID. He flipped it open without breaking eye contact. "I'm Ethan Brooks," he said, letting the name land like stone on the tile floor. "Owner and CEO of Family Grill." The entire diner went still. The clatter of plates stopped. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Every employee, every customer, turned. Scott's face drained of color faster than a flipped switch. His bravado evaporated like steam from a cold plate. You're, Scott stammered, words failing him. But Ethan didn't give him time to recover. "I've been sitting right here for days," Ethan continued evenly, "watching how you run my business, watching how you treat my people." His voice never rose, but somehow it cut sharper than any yell. "I've seen enough." Scott's hands fumbled uselessly with the receipt book, sweat already forming at his temples. "Sir, if there's been a misunderstanding, Ethan raised a single hand, silencing him. "There's no misunderstanding here," Ethan said. "You humiliated a dedicated employee in front of customers. You berated her without cause. You fostered fear in this team instead of respect. And worst of all, you forgot what this company was built for. Ethan turned slightly, his voice reaching everyone in the room. I built Family Grill to be more than just a place to eat. I built it to be a place where people, customers, and staff feel seen, valued, safe. He looked directly at Emily, who had frozen near table 6, her hands shaking as she clutched the tray. The look in her eyes said it all. Shock, relief, and something deeper. Hope. Effective immediately, Ethan said, turning back to Scott. You are suspended from your position pending a full investigation. HR will contact you for a formal exit process. Scott opened his mouth again, but the fight in him was gone. The staff had seen the truth. The customers had seen the truth. More importantly, he knew the truth about himself. Without another word, Scott gathered his things and slinked away, exiting the front doors of the Family Grill to a chorus of disbelieving stares and quiet murmurs. Ethan stood still for a beat longer, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then he turned, his gaze softer now, toward his employees, his people, especially Emily, and Adam, who had emerged from the kitchen, his expression a mixture of awe and cautious relief. To everyone here, Ethan said, his voice steady but warm, things are going to change. No one moved, but slowly, the tension in the room began to break like morning light. Customers exchanged glances of approval. Employees straightened their backs. And Emily, standing there with quiet grace after enduring so much, exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. This was not the end. This was the beginning of a new story. A story where kindness mattered, where dignity returned, where people like Emily Parker no longer stood alone. And Ethan Brooks, CEO, leader, and human being, was going to make sure of it. Tomorrow, Family Grill would not be the same. It would be better. And for the first time in a long time, everyone could feel it. After the emotional storm that had just swept through Family Grill, the restaurant was slowly settling into an almost reverent calm. The customers had witnessed something rare, a moment when truth triumphed over power, and justice stood tall in a world that often overlooked the quiet struggles of good people. But for Ethan Brooks, this night wasn't over. He wasn't the kind of CEO who would just deliver a powerful speech, fire a toxic manager, and disappear back into a boardroom. Not tonight. He stayed behind long after the last customer left, long after chairs had been flipped onto tables, and the scent of grilled meat and fresh bread had faded into the late-night silence. Emily Parker was still there, quietly wiping down the counter with the same gentleness she had shown every customer. Even after all that had happened, her motions were slower now. Exhaustion clung to her like an old, familiar coat. Adam Lewis, the young chef who had risked his job to stand up for her, was in the kitchen, stacking pans with quiet efficiency, stealing occasional glances her way, like a brother who had spent too long watching someone he cared about struggle in silence. Ethan approached them, his step steady but unassuming. He wasn't here as a CEO tonight. Not really. He was just Ethan, a man who had seen enough to feel deeply humbled. Emily, he called softly. She turned, startled for just a second. But when she saw him, something in her shoulders relaxed. Yes, sir? She asked politely, still holding on to that reflexive professionalism. But Ethan shook his head with a small, warm smile. Not sir tonight, he said. Just, Ethan, will you sit with me for a minute? She hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because sitting down, stopping, wasn't something life usually allowed her to do. Adam noticed and stepped in quietly. You should, it's okay now. Ethan noticed the way Adam spoke to her. Protective, kind. This wasn't a workplace built on hierarchy anymore. Not here, not tonight. This was family. They sat down together at a booth by the window. Outside, the streets of Riverdale were quiet. The neon sign of Family Grill flickered softly, like a heartbeat in the dark. Ethan folded his hands, looked Emily in the eyes, and asked the simplest, but most powerful question of the night. Will you tell me your story? And for the first time in a very long time, she did. She told him about her mother, battling illness for years, the hospital visits, the mounting medical bills that stretched far beyond anything a waitress's paycheck could cover. She told him about working double shifts, sometimes skipping meals herself so her mother wouldn't have to, about walking home late at night to the quiet streets, counting tips that never seemed to be enough. But through it all, she never complained. "I love working here," Emily whispered, her voice raw with honesty, "even when it's hard. Because for some people, this is their one happy place in the day. And if I can make that a little easier, I want to." Ethan sat in silence, humbled, shaken, listening with his whole heart. Adam quietly joined them, sliding into the booth beside her. "I've watched her do this for months," Adam said. "She doesn't talk about it. She just does it, every day. And none of us would have survived working under Scott if it weren't for her keeping this place together." Ethan leaned back, exhaling slowly. These were the people who built his company, not the regional managers, not the profit reports, not the polished marketing campaigns. It was Emily. It was Adam, the unsung heroes who chose kindness when no one asked them to. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but it carried the weight of promise. "Emily, Adam, tonight changed me," he admitted. "I started this business with a dream of a place where people felt safe, respected, and cared for. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what matters." He paused, then smiled, genuine and full of hope. "But you reminded me, and I won't forget again." Emily's eyes shimmered, not with the kind of tears born from exhaustion or defeat, but from something rare. Hope. Real, unshakable hope. Ethan stood, reaching into his pocket for a small notebook. "Tomorrow," he said firmly, "everything changes. For you, for this place, for everyone who's ever felt invisible doing the hardest jobs." He looked at them, not as employees, but as human beings who had earned every ounce of respect. Because kindness like yours is what makes this world worth fighting for. And in that quiet booth, in a small diner in Riverdale, under the hum of forgotten neon lights, something powerful happened. It wasn't just a conversation. It was a promise, a turning point, and the beginning of everything new that was to come. That night, Family Grill felt different. When Emily walked through the doors for her next shift, the weight she had carried for months felt strangely lighter, though she hardly dared to believe it. The echoes of what had happened the day before, the shocking reveal of Ethan Brooks as CEO, the firing of Scott Turner, the promise of change, still pulsed in the air like a distant heartbeat. But she didn't expect much. People like her, they learn not to hope too quickly. Ethan arrived quietly, dressed not in disguise this time, but still casual, approachable. He wasn't here to intimidate anyone. He was here to build, or rather rebuild, what had been lost. And tonight, it began with Emily. She was wiping down a corner booth when Ethan approached her, a calm warmth in his voice. "Emily," he said gently, "can we talk for a moment?" For a split second, panic flickered in her chest, the old reflex of someone used to being reprimanded more than praised. But the kindness in his eyes steadied her. They sat in a quiet corner of the restaurant. Adam Lewis, the young chef who had so often stood silently in her defense, joined them, his expression guarded but curious. Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, like an old friend about to share a truth. "I spent years building Family Grill," he began, "but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of why I started." His voice was low, steady, but filled with a quiet regret that only real leaders knew how to carry. "I built this place to be a family, for the people who walk in the door, but even more for the people who keep it alive every day behind the counter, in the kitchen, people like you." Emily's throat tightened. Nobody had ever said that to her before. "You've been through a lot, Emily," Ethan continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "More than anyone should carry. And still, you show up. You serve others with patience, with grace. I saw how you treated customers who didn't deserve your kindness. I saw how you carried the weight of this place when management failed you. Her hands trembled slightly, but she stayed quiet, afraid any words might break the fragile moment. And Adam, Ethan turned, nodded with respect. You stood up when it wasn't easy, when staying silent would have been safer. That tells me more about your character than any resume ever could. Adam's jaw tensed, not from pride, but from the quiet relief of being seen. Ethan reached into his jacket and placed 2 envelopes on the table. This is for you, Emily. She hesitated, opening it slowly, her breath catching when she saw what lay inside. A significant bonus. More money than she had ever seen in one place. Enough to pay for her mother's medical treatments. Enough to stop the late-night panic attacks about bills she couldn't pay. I know money can't fix everything, Ethan said gently, but it can buy you time and peace. Emily's vision blurred with tears. She tried desperately to blink away. And Adam, Ethan continued, sliding the second envelope toward him, effective immediately. I'm promoting you to shift manager. I trust you to lead this team the right way. Adam froze, the words almost not registering. You're giving me management? He whispered. You've already been leading, Ethan replied with a small smile. This just makes it official. But Ethan wasn't finished. There's one more thing, he added. His voice dropped, heavy with promise. Starting today, Family Grill is changing. We're implementing new policies across every location. No employee will work without fair pay again. We're establishing a hardship fund for staff in crisis. No more cutting hours to save costs. No more leaders who abuse their power. Silence hung in the air, but this time it was a stunned silence of hearts being repaired, piece by fragile piece. I failed you once, Ethan said, his voice roughened with emotion, but I won't fail you again. Emily couldn't hold back anymore. The tears fell, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming, unfamiliar feeling of finally being valued. Thank you, she whispered, not just for the money, for seeing me. Ethan nodded, humbled. You were always worth seeing, Emily. That night, Family Grill didn't just feel different. It was different. Emily stayed late, not because she had to, but because for the first time in a long time, this place didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like home. And when she walked out into the night, the streetlights of Riverdale seemed a little warmer, a little softer, like even the world outside had taken notice of the quiet return of justice. The days that followed marked a quiet but profound transformation inside Family Grill. Riverdale was a small town. News traveled fast. Customers who had once hesitated to return now came back, their eyes curious but hopeful. The rumor had spread like wildfire. The CEO himself had been here, undercover, and he had seen everything. But more importantly, he had changed everything. Ethan Brooks kept his word. Emily Parker was no longer just another overworked waitress in a worn apron. She walked through the doors of Family Grill every morning with a different kind of weight on her shoulders. Not the weight of exhaustion or silent struggle, but the weight of knowing she mattered. Her mother's treatments had already begun, paid for by the CEO's fund. The fear that had shadowed Emily's every step for years had finally begun to lift. And yet, Emily stayed, not because she needed the paycheck, but because Family Grill had become something else entirely. It was a place reborn. Adam Lewis, now the new shift manager, wore his apron with quiet pride. But his leadership was never loud, never harsh. He led by doing, by listening, by protecting the people who made this place feel like home. The old regulars noticed it first. The small things. Coffee refills came with genuine smiles. Mistakes were met with patience, not punishment. Staff walked with energy, not fear. The music even felt warmer somehow. Laughter creeping back into the corners where tension used to live. Ethan didn't disappear either. He visited often, not in a suit, not surrounded by assistants, but like any other man who loved a good meal and better company. He would sit near the window, coffee in hand, and watch, not just the business numbers, but the human moments, the way Adam paused to teach a new hire without frustration, the way Emily remembered how each customer liked their order, not because it was required, but because she cared, and most of all, the way the team looked out for one another like family. Family Grill had become more than just a diner. It had become a symbol, a living reminder that kindness, even the smallest act, when planted in the right soil, could bloom in ways no one expected. As for Scott Turner, his name became something else entirely, a cautionary tale, not out of spite, not to humiliate, but to remind everyone in the industry of a lesson too easily forgotten. Authority without character is empty. Years later, when new employees joined Family Grill, they would hear the story of a CEO who walked through their doors in disguise, of a waitress who never gave up on kindness, even when the world gave up on her, of a chef who chose courage over silence, and of a company that realized its greatest asset was never its profits, but its people. And maybe, just maybe, they would smile quietly to themselves and think, maybe this is the kind of place I want to be. Because here, at Family Grill, no one was invisible, no kindness was forgotten, and no voice, however small, went unheard. Final message appears on screen. In a world full of noise, real strength lies in kindness spoken in whispers. Real leadership begins when no one is watching, and real legacy is built on how you make people feel when they leave your table. Fade out. Soft acoustic music plays. The Family Grill logo appears. A single line lingers for the audience. Kindness leaves a flavor no recipe can match. In the end, it was never about the food. It was never about the business. It was always about people, about how we treat those who have the least power, about the quiet hearts who give without asking for anything in return, about kindness, the kind that nobody sees, until one day it changes everything. Because in every company, in every home, in every life, success is never measured by what you take. It's measured by what you give, when no one is watching. And sometimes, the smallest kindness becomes the biggest reason someone chooses hope tomorrow. That's the real legacy worth building, forever.